My son is in love with his professor, but if he learns the truth about her it'll break his heart, so I have to do everything I can to protect him and get her fired. I'm new to this whole thing, so cut my some slack. I'm also a bit stressed because my son's professor is ruining our lives. I'm a 49-year-old woman from the country, but it's not that I'm not educated. I went to college, which was more than I can say for most girls in my class of 89 farm kids, but I ended up back here teaching physical education to K-4th graders at our elementary school. That's right, I'm a gym teacher. And with my husband Dutch's drywall work, we've made a nice life for ourselves out here in the sticks, where life is slow and cost of living is cheap. It afforded us the chance to see our only child Henry off to college, where he'd just about immediately start an affair with his English professor, who's now making our lives a living hell. Henry's only 19 years old and had hardly been out of his hometown, had hardly seen a building taller than 3 stories. And he was in the big city just a few months when this English professor named Jamie Jones took total advantage of his simple heart. Look, I realize that my son is a grown adult now. A grown man actually. But now this Dr. Jones, who's just 5 years younger than me, has him wrapped around her little finger, and increasingly so every day. You might be asking how Dutch and I found out about this affair. Well, that's simple, our son told us. He was so happy about having a girlfriend that he blabbed it at Thanksgiving dinner. Henry never really had a girlfriend in high school, and he was always a bit of an awkward kid. He was always more into working on his cars than anything else, preferably foreign ones. I could see him responding to any attention that any woman threw his way, but I didn't understand why it had to be his professor who was over twice his age. I mean, he was at college. There were plenty of girls his own age that he could meet. I even looked up the gender demographics of the student body and learned that there's more girls than boys. Surely there was something else going on with this woman, and I decided that I had to know about it. But what I found out would eventually convince me that was a big mistake. I told Dutch that I was going to go and meet with this Dr. Jones myself. I'd drive into the city and show up unannounced at her campus office. I'd confront her and tell her to stay away from my son and date people her own age. I didn't yet know that she wasn't only dating someone her own age, she was married to some bigwig at the university. It was a fact that Henry curiously left out at Thanksgiving dinner over his second helping of cranberry sauce. I discovered it before I even left, when I was just social media stalking her late that night after too many glasses of Chardonnay. I simply couldn't believe it. She looked so innocent and mousy in her oversized sweater and big framed glasses, but there were secrets in her eyes that I knew spelled serious trouble for my family. I packed an overnight bag while Dutch sat on the bed and watched. My husband's a good old boy, there's no doubt about it. There's no way he had the emotional vocabulary to deal with a situation as serious as this one. To tell you the truth, I'm not so sure how he felt about the whole thing. I think at first he was just happy that Henry was out of the house and living his life. He actually assumed this professor was just a couple years older than him, like some of the teachers were at his high school. But obviously it wasn't like that at all. The road into the city was boring as usual. All I could think about was what I was going to say to her when I saw her. Would I be able to suppress the urge to scream in her face? I honestly didn't know if I could. I decided to scope out the school first and wait to see her walk into her office. As I sat there in my freezing car at 7 in the morning, I realized how insane this situation was, and how creepily obsessive I became. I was still going to confront her, but I realized there was a time and place for everything. I decided this wasn't the best way to go about it, and that I would call and set up an appointment like a normal adult human being. But then I looked up and saw a black BMW pulling into the parking lot. I was looking at the driver, hoping it would be Dr. Jones, only to be shocked to see my son's big head floating above the steering wheel instead. He takes after his dad in the big head department. But it was a double shock when I looked over and saw who was in the passenger seat. It was Dr. Jones herself. I easily recognized her big dumb glasses. And just like in the pictures, her graying matronly bun wasn't doing her any favors. Now what could I do? I couldn't very well confront them both right there on the street without looking like a complete and total psychopath. Henry simply can't know that I traveled all the way here to confront his little professor girlfriend. But why were they arriving here together at 7 a.m.? Henry specifically schedules all of his classes for as late in the day as possible. And why was he driving her car? One of my questions was answered when I realized that Henry was just dropping Dr. Jones off. She got out of the BMW and walked toward the building. She was even shorter than I expected her to be, and then waved at my son as he drove off. I didn't quite know what to do, but I only had 2 choices. I could either follow Dr. Jones inside, or I could follow my son in her $100,000 sedan. Seeing my son triggered something in me though, and suddenly my protective material instincts took over. I realized that I needed to follow him and see where he was driving in this thing and where he'd eventually be parking it. I assumed he'd be going back to his dorm room, but how could I be sure? I had to remind myself that I couldn't be certain of anything anymore. Instead I waited until Dr. Jones was inside and then did something that I never thought I'd do, follow my son. I realized from watching enough movies with Dutch that I had to stay a couple car lengths behind him. I can't imagine how I would explain my presence here if he happened to spot me. I guess I'd just have to make up some story about how I was just dropping in to see him. But who drives 5 hours just to drop in? And besides, I'd just seen him. And I'd be seeing him again at Christmas in a few weeks anyway. One thing for certain, Henry got his driving habits from his father as well, and they aren't the mean masculine aggressive type. My son and husband drive like old ladies, to tell you the truth, and it drives me crazy. I always end up being the perpetual backseat driver, barking at them to slow down or speed up. I was honestly happy to see that he carried his habits over into his college years, because as annoying as they were, I never worried about him getting into an accident. At least not one that he would have been the cause of. I continued to follow him, and it became clear pretty quickly that he wasn't going to the dorms. The dorms are literally on campus, and I know exactly where this is because we were all there on move-in day. It was even clearer when I followed him onto the highway, where his cautious driving seemed to fly out the window. I could barely keep up with him in the fast lane, which meant there was a greater chance he'd notice that someone was tailing him. Thankfully, a construction zone slowed him down long enough for me to blend in with traffic until he took the Farmers Road exit. We were past the suburbs now, out in the country, and I had to keep my distance from him to keep from being noticed. On my right side were the occasional private driveway leading up a wooded path, and it's one of these where Henry finally turns into. I continued on, careful not to be noticed, then turned around and slowly creeped up to the drive. I could just barely make out the top of the house from above the tree line, but it was clearly massive. Was this Dr. Jones' house? It had to be. But she definitely didn't buy it on a professor's salary, even at that overpriced school. So clearly her husband was loaded, which of course thickens the plot. But what was my son doing driving his wife's car here at 7:30 in the morning? Unless he wasn't home, of course. I turned around and pulled over on a bend in the road. I was at an angle so that Henry wouldn't be able to see me if he came out of the driveway. After just a few minutes, I heard the rumblings of his old Ford coming up the drive. It peeked out of the front of the driveway and then turned back from where we came. I can only assume back to the dorms. The only thing I could think about was where the husband was. Was it a business trip? Or does he just leave for work really early in the morning? And what is it that he does anyway? Well, one of my questions would be answered a few minutes later. Because as I was sitting there trying to figure out what to do next, I noticed another BMW coming up the drive from the house. This time his was a late middle-aged man in a suit who I could only assume was Mr. Jones. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Dr. Jones's husband knew that his wife was having an affair with Henry, and he didn't care? That was the only scenario that seemed possible. I went back to my hotel in a daze. What kind of weird stuff had Henry got himself mixed up in? I know it's stupid, but I felt like I was the one to blame. I was the one who encouraged him to go off to the big city for school anyway. And now look at him. He's been corrupted by his swinging professors. Honestly, I had no idea what was going on. I wanted to call Dutch and ask him what he thought I should do, but this new information may honestly give him a heart attack. So I sat with it alone all day, totally lost in a maze of my own dark thoughts. Obviously Henry was just too naive and immature to realize that he was being used. Even if I tried talking some sense into him, there was not much of a chance that he would listen. I needed to have a talk with Dr. Jones. One-on-one. Just her and I. It was the only way that I'd be able to get to the bottom of what was going on, and what I could do to stop it. I looked up Dr. Jones's class schedule on the university website and saw that she's teaching a late class tonight at 7:45. Afterwards, I'm going to be waiting for her right outside the classroom. I'll tell her who I am and that we needed to talk, and if she wanted to avoid a scene, I'd suggest we take this conversation to her office. It was a good plan. Straight to the point and with as many witnesses around for the initial encounter as possible. What do you all think I should do? I feel like I've examined it from every angle and there simply is no good or easy call to make. Maybe I'm crazy for doing all of this, but I feel this gut natural instinct to protect my son. There are probably better ways to go about helping your kids, but now that I'm in the middle of it I have no other choice. Update 1. I'm back at my hotel after one of the craziest nights of my life, and I don't think I'll be getting to sleep anytime soon, so here's an update. At 7:15 I headed out to the college and parked near the building where Dr. Jones was going to be teaching. As I walked inside I noticed that the building was nearly deserted. It seemed like Dr. Jones was the only one having a class this late tonight. I sat outside in the hall and listened to her impassioned lecture. I have to say, she was an inspiring speaker. I was starting to get excited about 17th century British literature. The class finally ended and students began streaming out, but she was of course the last one to leave. She was alone though. She had a different young man with her, and the two seemed very deep in conversation. I stood waiting for them to finish until they finally both seemed to notice me at the same time. They awkwardly said goodbye and shook hands while I just started at Dr. Jones, daring her to speak first. But of course, she had no idea who I was. For all she knew, I was just some weird middle-aged woman who'd wandered in off the street. Can I help you?" she asked in a mocking, nasally tone. I told her that she most definitely can help, by staying the heck away from my son. She looked at me puzzled, like she had no idea what I was talking about. Like I just accused her of stealing my pet tortoise. I told her not to play dumb, that I saw her with him. But she still seemed totally puzzled by my accusation. It was then that I realized I'd have to be more specific for Dr. Jones. She apparently had more than one student boyfriend around campus this year. So she wasn't only corrupting our youth, I thought. She was breaking their hearts as well. She finally realized who I was talking about when I mentioned seeing him driving the BMW, and her face broke out into a wide grin. I asked her what was so funny, and when she finally told me, I honestly didn't know whether to cry or scream. She was shocked that I thought Henry and her were having an affair. She explained that Henry has been doing some work on her husband's cars. He had dropped her off on campus because he was test driving the BMW. I found the story to be ludicrous, but I'd soon find out that it was true. She showed me pictures on her phone that she took of Henry showing her husband the engine. She thought it was hilarious out of the element her husband was and wanted to take a picture for her sister. I realized that did not prove anything. Why would Henry lie to us about the relationship? It turns out Dr. Jones may not have been having an affair with him, but she most definitely was having an affair with multiple students. Henry would later tell us after Dutch and I both confronted him, that he knew other guys who'd slept with Dr. Jones, and just got carried away with telling people that he had too. He said he didn't even mean to tell us on Thanksgiving, but his Uncle Johnny let him drink whiskey with him before dinner and it went to his head. My poor son. He was feeling so insecure about himself and his lack of a relationship that he made up oi with his professor. Dutch and I realized that our boy had serious self-esteem issues that we didn't realize. We got him into some counseling and slowly but surely I think he's doing much better. He's made a lot more friends at school, and some of them are even girls. He doesn't have a girlfriend yet, at least not officially, but there's a girl named Sammy that he's been spending an awful lot of time with lately. As far as Dr. Jones is concerned, her exploits with multiple students were actually discovered not long after my encounter with her, but I swear that I had absolutely nothing to do with it. A jealous girlfriend of one of her young lovers actually turned her into the administration. When multiple other students came forward, it was only a matter of time before she was shown the door. Even her powerful husband couldn't save her in the end.